So what do we have here? Yes, a dreaded prequel, although this was published all the way back in 1988. So this is before every piece of IP needed a prequel to explain all those things that you never really needed to know about. I blame George Lucas for this, naturally. This is, as the title would suggest, a original series Star Trek tie-in novel, although Kirk, McCoy, and the rest only show up as part of the framing for the wider story. This is set after the City on the Edge of Forever, and actually manages to incorporate some of Harlan Ellison's original concepts, or at least the conclusion to how he wrote that episode. The idea that Edith Keeler's death would be something that would haunt Kirk beyond the 60-minute TV episode and on into the future. Essentially, Kirk has gone back to the family homestead in Iowa and has dug out some of his father's written letters to him, talking about his time while Kirk was growing up. Essentially, we then get George Kirk's experiences with the first ship, Enterprise, or at least the ship that would become Kirk's Enterprise eventually, under the command of Robert April. A nice bit of tie-in here with the animation series, I should say the first one, because from what we know of that, April is a captain who wears a sweater and who married his chief medical officer. She gets introduced as well in this. The book starts out with a foreword written by Carey's husband, an occasional collaborator, pointing out that part of the idea behind this was to create something that wouldn't be the Federation that we knew and loved from the original series, that this was still Starfleet and the Federation developing the various concepts that would become essentially what Kirk would give us histrionics about in the original series. All the openness, equality, exploration, and yes, a little bit of a military backbone. This means that the first chunk of the story, in flashback at least, is essentially Kirk's father and April going back and forth, having those lovely philosophical discussions that Star Trek does oh so frequently. In other words, how much should this be about exploration and how much should it be about blowing up stuff real good? I'm reminded of that line from Star Trekkers, the parody song, "We come in peace, shoot to kill," which, let's face it, does kind of get the mentality of James T. Kirk and his Enterprise quite effectively. Now, the problem with this thing is that essentially you have to really ignore logic when dealing with the flashback bits. I'm going to minor spoil this. Basically, the reason why the Enterprise, no, it's not named the Enterprise, must be sent out on this mission is there's a ticking clock, a ship with some settlers on it must be rescued, but the technology of the Federation normally uses low warp up to warp 4 or 5, only for short jumps, no transporters, no library computer, just can't handle it, so they need to send this new starship out. It has a 30-minute shakedown cruise, which we get to experience. Okay. The problem is with the plot is that if that was all that April and the rest had to deal with, that would be fine. But we get complications. And, okay, spoiler, they're the Romulans. Now, to tie this in with what we know from the original series, no one knowing they're Vulcan, that sort of thing, it takes some tap dancing and, I admit, a somewhat creative way to get around that in the end. Unfortunately, this means we get a big gulping help of Romulan politics, internal politics in particular, with quasi-Roman equivalents, but it's all very convoluted and not terribly explained well, and it's rather frustrating, especially because I suspect, although it's been years since I watched Star Trek Enterprise, that a lot of this has been retconned into oblivion by now. I also, presumably Strange New Worlds is messing stuff up too, but I'm too lazy to actually look it up. Now, as far as complications go, I get that in fiction you want to pile complications on complications and push our characters to the limit. But we don't just have the rescue mission, we don't just have a Romulan complication, but we get more stuff too. Yes, we get saboteurs. Not only is the ship that is not Enterprise yet new, and presumably would have gremlins in it, but there's actual saboteurs on board too. So George Kirk gets to try to investigate that, being a security chief. And furthermore, we get an inexplicable subplot involving the transporters, which I remind you are new, and a creature which gets beamed up from the surface and runs amok on the ship, which, when I came across it, I basically put down the book and started laughing because, really? We're going here? Now, I suppose it sounds like I'm being pretty negative on this thing, and it's not my favorite of Star Trek tie-in fiction, but it does actually get there in the end. The last, I'd say 20% or so is actually quite good, and comes out with a rather thrilling conclusion and actually manages to tie up all those loose ends relatively well. So I like that, at least. So where does this thing sit on my shelf? Or my virtual shelf, I should say. I liked it. I slightly liked it. Mostly because eventually things did get interesting in the end. And some of the conversations, it was at least nice to have George Kirk basically say, yeah, you're going to have weapons if you're going to actually go exploring, which is a good point. The Easter egg about the ship's name, Enterprise, and where that comes from, George Kirk just happens to suggest Enterprise and rattle off the various histories of the U.S. naval vessels, entitled it. If you've ever wanted a Star Trek book to mention the War of 1812, this is the book for you. It's rather silly, and of course it's been retconned because of Star Trek Enterprise, but it's fine. This is probably I might pick it up maybe 5 years down the road again. Carey's a good writer. There's quality here. The characterization's nice. The James T. Kirk subplot of him deciding that, yes, he will continue to be the captain of the Enterprise is concluded rather abruptly, quite frankly. Kirk basically reads a paragraph in one of the letters and kind of snaps out of his funk and then returns to the ship and realizes the ship is my home, which is fine because at this point in the timeline, at least in Jim Kirk's timeline, we can't make any changes. And in fact, historically, until I guess in the 90s of the joint universe between Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, there was a sense that you had to reset each of the tie-in novels back to the earlier status quo, essentially. So I liked it, just not that much. I'll probably be reading more. I know there are some more books set at this rough timeline, particularly dealing with the Romulans. There's a 6-book series by Diane Duane that I have on the Kindle. And I'll probably be reading that sometime soon. But otherwise, this was an interesting look at a unusual time in the Star Trek media tie-in where there isn't constant material coming out. And the books were basically all we had, although Next Generation would have been running at this point. All in all, a book more interesting in how it deals with the various constrictions of the Star Trek universe than maybe in the actual nuts and bolts of it. As always, like, comment, and subscribe. And if you think I'm full of it, by all means, feel free to argue with me in the comments.